What's up, Rockstar? Matt Artisan here. As you probably know, we conduct a lot of our boot camps in other countries. And a lot of guys come from US and Canada and they start thinking about, wow, this would be really cool to live somewhere else, live outside their home country. So today I want to talk about just that. All the nuances, pitfalls, and advantages of leaving your home country and becoming an expat, expatriate, and living abroad. Where should you consider? What are the pros and cons of certain areas, regions, or countries? So, as you may know, I first left the US and decided to live outside the US in 2012. I decided I'm gonna spend a year traveling and just go to a bunch of different countries and see where I like the best. That 1 year turned into 4 years. I spent 4 years just traveling. The most I spent in one city was 3 months. And during that time span, I visited about 70 countries. I'm at 89 or 90 at the time of this video. So here's the deal. If you're making US money, or at least a few $1,000s a month, then living outside the US, as long as you can continue that source of income, if you can work for a company in the US or start your own online type of business, or we can even talk about buying businesses in other countries, but most of you are probably not interested in that. I have done it. I own a restaurant in Mexico, and it actually makes me a decent amount of money. But that's something I wouldn't start off with. It's a better idea to either work for a company in the US, negotiate that you can work from home and work abroad, or start your own online business. You don't want to move to Southeast Asia and work at a restaurant or get a job that pays you a Southeast Asian salary. I don't recommend that. I recommend at the bare minimum have a consistent salary of at least $2,000, and that's only if you don't have a lot of expenses except for rent, which you can find a decent place, a studio apartment in a good part of the city in most countries in Southeast Asia, for example here in the Philippines, for about $500 a month. Food, if you're not eating out all the time and you're not going to fancy restaurants, is about the same amount, I think, about $500. I would budget for that. Dates can fit into that $500 or maybe a little bit extra for dates. And then a little bit of money for traveling. You're probably gonna wanna go on some trips once in a while, and there's a few other expenses, but what's much better is if you can make at least $5,000 a month, then you can live much better. You can get $1,000 a month apartment, and you're not gonna have to budget and worry really at all. You can essentially live like a king. And I'm gonna assume that that's your reason for leaving the United States. At least it's one of the reasons. Usually the main reasons are it's cheaper in other places, and we'll talk about which places. And potentially you can get just treated much better. For example, if you're a single guy, dating can be a little bit easier in other places. And third, it could just be the culture, the adventure of just living somewhere else. So let's talk about number one. The 3 regions I recommend exploring would be Southeast Asia, like I mentioned. My favorites are, of course, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. But if you're not attracted to Asian girls, you prefer white girls, then Eastern Europe is the place to be. Normally, I'd recommend Ukraine. That's probably where I spent the most of my time in Eastern Europe, at least 7-8 trips to Ukraine. Right now, as I'm filming this, there is a war, unfortunately, so it's not a possibility, or at least it's not a good idea to go to Ukraine. And Russia was my other favorite, believe it or not. Not St. Petersburg or Moscow, but other big cities. Hopefully one day it'll be safe to return. And there'll be flights, because right now I actually looked into going and there's no flights available. So your other options would be Moldova is the cheapest country in Europe. It's the least expensive country in Europe. It's also not a touristy destination, so there's not a lot of foreigners there. So you have a little bit of an advantage being a foreigner. You're a little bit more unique. I'd say the downside is Russia could invade. So hopefully you're watching this in like 2028 or 29 and that's not a conflict. That's not an issue anymore. Or maybe it's worse. I don't know. We'll see when we get to that point. But that's the only downside that I see right now. It's bordering Russia. It would be an easy country for Russia to invade. Hopefully you'd have enough time to get out. Another option is Romania. I think Romanian women are gorgeous. It's It's also very inexpensive to live in Bucharest and some of the smaller cities. And a few other quick options will be Bulgaria, especially the coast. Sofia, I did not see a lot of attractive women there when I went in the summertime, but Varna and other coastal cities are amazing. And of course, Croatia, Prague is starting to get a little bit more expensive. There's Latvia, Lithuania. Just really the entire Eastern European region is fairly inexpensive compared to the United States or Western Europe, and there's a lot of attractive women. The next region would be Latin America. Now, I actually live in Mexico. Besides the Philippines, I also live in Mexico. And ironically, I've probably done the least amount of traveling, but the most amount of living in Latin America, particularly Colombia. Medellin, Colombia is amazing. I bought a condo there back in 2015. It turned out to be a great investment. I ended up selling it just because I decided Mexico is a little bit better for me, but I would definitely put it in my top 5 places on the planet to live as far as beautiful women and it being very inexpensive. I've also checked out a few other places in Central America and South America, but I honestly haven't spent enough time there. Argentinians are gorgeous, by the way, but there's a lot in Mexico, so you could just come to Mexico. So I'm not going to go into all the countries in Latin America. Really what you want to do for all 3 of these regions is you want to explore them on your own. If you have one of the 3 that you know you already prefer, maybe it's just because you like the culture, you like the women, or it's cheaper in Southeast Asia than it is in Eastern Europe for the most part, and you know that's where you want to go, then go to that region, spend, I would say, a few weeks in each country, explore a few different cities, and then decide where you want to spend the next year. Because if you get an apartment for a year, it's going to be a lot cheaper than getting Airbnbs and just paying monthly. But the other option is you can do what I did and just bounce around. Spend a few weeks in each city and then go somewhere else. It's a lot of fun. The problem is I got tired of it after 4 years because I didn't have a social circle. I had friends in all these places, which was kind of cool, and I ended up going back to a lot of places. But eventually, I got kind of tired of just approaching. Like the only way I was meeting girls was online dating and approaching. I wanted to create a social circle. That's why I came here. So I live half the year here now in the Philippines and half the year in Mexico. And I have social circles in both places. And now after living abroad for over a decade, there's no way in hell I would ever live in the United States again. Not knocking the US. In fact, I'm originally from Southern California. It's one of the best places to live in the United States. Amazing weather, amazing beaches, but still, I wouldn't live there when I can live somewhere else that has amazing beaches and amazing women, and it's half the price or even more. And a place where I actually prefer the culture even more. Now, there's certain things that are a downside if you're used to banking in the United States, paying with credit cards, things like that. Some countries, for example, here in the Philippines, banking is a pain in the ass. You want to take out a large sum of money or even deposit a large sum of money, sometimes it's just a pain in the ass. You got to fill out a bunch of forms and it just takes time. Versus the US, you can just do it on your phone. Speaking of technology, apps like banking apps, for example, suck, at least in my experience. There might be some that are good, but I haven't found any. So certain things like that, not so good. Also, paying at restaurants and a lot of places just don't take credit cards. In fact, even when you're paying for something that might cost a few $1,000s, they will only accept cash. For example, you're doing a surgery or something like that. I know, it's crazy, but that's just the way it is. So it's something you gotta get used to. You gotta just get used to having a lot of cash. I recommend have a safe in your house, have a lot of cash in there, because it's just a pain in the ass to go to the ATM all the time. And other things like, what else? Like paying your property taxes. You have to actually physically go downtown and go to the city hall and pay with cash to pay your property taxes. Unlike Mexico, for example, Mexico is a lot closer to the United States in terms of infrastructure and just it being more like a first world country like the US. In fact, a lot of times things are easier in Mexico in my experience. For example, going to the doctor. Oh my gosh, also here in the Philippines, it's typically like way cheaper and just way easier. They won't accept your insurance, of course, but you just walk in and sometimes you can get seen right away. Like if I want blood work, both in Mexico or here in the Philippines, I don't make an appointment. I just walk in and say, hey, I want some blood work. Can you check my testosterone, for example? And they'll just be like, yeah, we can do it right now. It's $40. It's just simple. Certain things are simpler, like medical and hospitals, but other things like banking are a lot more difficult. So you just got to get used to some things being more convenient, but a lot of things being less convenient. So all in all, if you're thinking about moving abroad, I say, why not? At least go take a trip if you can for a few weeks, ideally a few months. Go explore a couple different places and see for yourself what it could be like living somewhere like here in the Philippines, Mexico, other places in Southeast Asia, other places in Latin America, Eastern Europe. The downside there, though, is it gets cold in the winter, which I don't like. That's why I never really considered living in Europe, except in the summers. I used to spend all my summers in Europe, not in one place, but just kind of bouncing around. And I might start doing that again, but like I said, I would never go back to the US. It's just an amazing experience living in other countries. So I highly recommend it. Shoot me a DM on Instagram if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you there.